Welcome to Let's Talk, a podcast series by the Electrochemical Safety Research Institute at Underwriters Laboratories. In the Let's Talk series, we share conversations with experts and scientists in the fields of energy storage systems, safety science, and standards, and learn about their experiences and visions. I'm your host, Taina, and today we will be talking about battery recycling. As the popularity of portable electronics as well as electric and hybrid vehicles grows worldwide, so does the number of spent lithium-ion batteries that are used to power those devices. However, it is estimated that currently only few of those batteries are recycled worldwide. To talk more about this, our guest today is Dr. Sloop, who is the president and founder of On2 Technology, a company that is developing advanced recycling solutions for lithium-ion batteries. Steve has pioneered comprehensive methods to improve safety and efficiency in recycling lithium-ion batteries and materials. These innovations include deactivation of lithium-ion batteries to eliminate hazards in transportation and storage, electrolyte extraction, electrode harvesting and separation, and direct methods to reintroduce lithium, the structure and performance to scrap electrodes. Steve, welcome to our podcast, and thank you very much for being here.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Steve, you have been working on battery recycling for a very long time, even before it was the hot topic it is today. So could you tell us a little bit about how you first started working on developing recycling methods for lithium-ion batteries?
In the late 90s, I was a postdoc at Lawrence Berkeley Lab, and we're working on solid-state batteries, lithium-ion failure mechanisms, non-flammable electrolytes, everything that people are still working on today too. But one of the issues that came up came to mind, especially when we were looking at the failure mechanisms for lithium-ion, is the what are we going to do for recycling? And so that just became a thought that was reoccurring. And it was impressed upon me from the costs for manufacturing of lithium-ion or lithium batteries in general, that you have to be able to have a secondary production and recycling of materials that's going to help meet those costs. And so that's really the foundation that happened, is that we're studying failure mechanisms. And I said, well, how are we going to get this back into the manufacturing? And then also just the knowledge of those materials to say that there's opportunities here with these battery materials for unique types of recycling that can be a low cost.
Okay, thank you. Those are excellent points. So lithium-ion batteries have been around for about 30 years, and many of them are currently not recycled, as you mentioned. So the situation is quite different compared to, for example, lead-acid batteries, almost all of which are recycled. So could you comment on why recycling of lithium-ion batteries has not received the same attention, and perhaps requirements have not been yet set for lithium-ion battery chemistry?
For lead, one of the first reasons is that lead is a RCRA listed type element, so it's a hazard by definition, and so that there has to be handling and accountability for lead that's put out into the market. So there's some of that, but before it was listed, even the lead battery industry's been around for a while, and I think that naturally has developed into the industry it is today, which is really foundationally has recycling supporting it. But before that, maybe it wasn't such a front of mind issue and really part of that. So it's evolved over the decades. And so just like the lithium-ion battery industry or high energy density battery industry, the same type of evolution is occurring, and I think we're starting to see that now. Another thing is, just technically speaking, lead melts at a pretty low temperature, and it's a very fungible type of metal that has been used, since the Bronze Age, right? People have been melting and handling lead and for generations, multi-generations. And so that type of technical reason, I think, is that it's a low melting metal, and it does have a long history of use. It's a little bit different than, say, lithium battery materials that are really modern age nanotechnology, highly designed, and we're just sort of learning how to use these in a circular type of an economy, like what's been established for lead. So it's a little bit of a long answer, but there's some technical reasons, there's some regulatory reasons that are there, and then historical, I would say.
That's a very good answer. Thank you so much. For lithium-ion batteries, there are several processes that can be used to recycle them. Pyrometallurgical and hydrometallurgical processes are in industry use today, and you have really pioneered direct recycling methods. So could you talk a little bit about these different techniques and explain the typical steps that a lithium-ion battery goes through in the recycling process?
Thanks for the question, Tanya. This is a good question, and it really relates to the previous question too about for lead. For recycling lithium-ion batteries now, the go-to approaches, like you said, are pyrometallurgy and hydrometallurgy. And if we kind of back up and say, well, why is that? In a way, there's nothing that's really out there for recycling. So we say, okay, well, what should we do? What does it look like? Well, it looks like a catalyst, maybe that we have some recycling capabilities for, and there's pyrometallurgy that has been used for recycling catalysts, and really aiming at, say, keeping cobalt recovered and used in industrial processing. And so the lithium battery materials kind of rhyme with those other catalysts. And so it's been able to be exploited for recovery of lithium battery materials, especially cobalt. And so how does that happen? It's a burning high temperature process to concentrate metals. So the non-metallic materials stay as an oxide, and those usually float on top of a molten metallic alloy mixture of metals. And then that is cooled, and then you have a metallic piece that needs to be purified into its into its components. So that's the pyrometallurgy. Really what that is doing is harvesting, let's say, those metals in that process, really focusing on cobalt. Cobalt and nickel are in that mixture, perhaps some copper, and others. Things like lithium end up being in what's called that slag body, what we were talking about, the metal oxide that kind of floats on top of the molten material. So that's what's kind of going on in this in a pyrometallurgical process. Is you have the heavier transition metals are molten, and then they solidify, and then are hydrometallurgically purified from there. So on the other hand, if you were to take a hydrometallurgical process, this is like the name implies, they're going to use some water chemistry here with strong acids and reducing agents to dissolve the metals into a solution. And what's left behind are organics, plastics, carbons, things like that won't dissolve. And so, but in either case, you have a solution of valuable metals on the hydrometallurgical side, or you have a solid of the valuable metals that are going to be brought up into a solution, and then they have to be purified. So in either case, that purification is done through solution chemistry using water and oil-like materials, so that you can partition one metal into an oily solvent and the other one into a water-like solvent. And there's acids and surfactants and things like this that go into the process to be able to wash those and partition them and collect them. And in that process, you have fluctuations of pH, so it has to go from acid to base, maybe numerous times to be able to get to a pure salt. So in any case, the idea then is to purify these metals, whether it's in whatever fraction it is, and then you have to precipitate them. And the first go around on any precipitation, it's always a mess. They aren't perfect, and you end up with material that needs to be redissolved, gone through the same type of process, reprecipitated. And the reason is you have to do this numerous times to be able to get to a pure salt, pure metal salt that's, let's say, meeting an industrial specification for sale. So it's maybe a little bit of a long-winded answer, but hydro dissolves the metals, has to precipitate them, and you have to reprecipitate things to get to purity. Pyrometallurgy concentrates those metals through a high temperature process and then goes through this hydro process to end up with purified metal salts. In both cases, many people will say, oh, what happens to the lithium in this? It's always possible to recapture lithium, and with either method. In a pyrometallurgy, that will be through treating the slag body that's formed during the pyro process. And in hydrometallurgy, you can end up with lithium in that solution that you have to then remove, and that's done through, like precipitation of a carbonate at some point. If you step back and say, okay, well, how do we get lithium in the first place? It's either through a brine or through a solid, a spodumene type rock. And getting lithium from a rock is about 3 times as expensive as getting lithium from a brine. So if we look at scrap batteries, they're kind of like rocks in a way. So our cost of getting the lithium back out, putting it in a bottle, is going to be very similar to that cost differential. The lithium from a recycling hydro or pyro is going to be more expensive than lithium from a brine. And this actually highlights an issue. And back to lead, one of the reasons lead is such a success story is that the recycled lead is less expensive than primary lead. So from one generation to the next in terms of batteries, you have this recycled material as secondary lead. The secondary material is less expensive. Okay, backtrack to what I just said. Lithium from the battery is going to be more expensive than the original material. That's a problem. So for the big experiment of electric vehicles, for them to survive, we have to have materials that are less expensive from one generation to another. So by definition, we've got recycling processes that are making expensive materials. So we can't keep going from one generation to another with more expensive materials. It's part of the reason why direct recycling is a good tool to address this, because the energy inputs for direct recycling are so much less than for hydro and pyro. So you do have the opportunity then to have lower cost materials from one generation to another. A direct recycled cathode, the lithium stays in it. It's already there. And so it's in the space where it needs to be. Now we're going to figure out how to use that cathode material again in a new manufacturing cycle.
Okay, thank you. So you talked about the metals in the batteries, how we can collect them, or the cathode materials themselves and reuse those. But how about the other components in the battery? I mean, the battery casing, the battery electrolytes, or the plastics in the battery. Can those be recycled?
Tanya, this is a great question. Yeah, the other components, definitely, and the short answer is yes, they can be recycled. And then the longer answer is, well, how do you go about doing that, and what kind of value do you have at the end? But I think that all of those issues can be addressed with proper design of recycling. And for instance, electrolyte, it's possible to extract electrolyte and have it as a feedstock for new electrolyte materials, the organic components, the salts and that in the electrolyte. The plastic casings, things like this, are recyclable as plastics may be. Sometimes that's more complicated than not. Separator materials are very recyclable, and in fact, we've used them as feedstock for a diesel product in our laboratory, and cooperation with other industries in the plastics recycling area. The metals also, they have copper foils, aluminum foils, and those can be recycled and reused too. That said, everything in these that we've just talked about has to meet some sort of a specification for being used in manufacturing in another product. And so there's always those little challenges, and sometimes they're big challenges, but the short answer goes back to is, yeah, there's all kinds of materials there that can be recycled. They tend to lead into then, plastics recycling. We could have a whole show on plastics recycling in and of itself, and so say, oh yeah, the problems there, that without minimizing, and then the anode material, currently graphite, is another direct recyclable material. We've built batteries out of recycled graphite in our laboratory and with manufacturing test partners anyway. And so all of those components can be treated and brought back to a certain level of functionality, sometimes even better than what was beginning. And then as we move forward to other types of chemistries, those challenges will be changing as we go. But all of this is a good problem, and each one of these components has pathways for recycling in the broader industrial market.
Great, thank you. So most of the current waste batteries going into recycling are small-scale batteries from portable electronics, whereas the rapid rise in the numbers of electric vehicles will lead to higher amounts of large end-of-life EV batteries. So are there any challenges or opportunities that the larger scale of the EV batteries brings to the recycling process?
The prototypical products for lithium-ion have been small batteries, and so from a recycling standpoint, everything's distributed then. You have to put a lot of work into getting back a very small battery. And so if we have larger batteries, that the reward for the work is better. You don't have to fillet a lot of minnows to get your meal, let's say. And with larger batteries, there certainly are. Then there's a lot more material. On the flip side, those larger batteries don't necessarily have the same valuable elements that the smaller ones do. Smaller ones tend to be pretty heavy with cobalt. The larger ones don't have a lot of cobalt, and at least into the future certainly will be, because it's expensive, and so we've had to figure out how to get around that. Anyway, so there's opportunities. There's two sides to that. You can build for scale and processing because of the size of the battery, but the recovery of materials might be a little bit different. And actually, the first and foremost is the safety issues are quite different between a small battery and a large battery. The risks for the risk for a fire may be the same, but if one happens, the big battery is going to have a bigger fire than a small battery, let's say. So the industrial safety of that is a major concern, and part of our comprehensive approach for recycling is to address that safety in processing and storage and transportation of end-of-life batteries. So for small batteries, we see events that occur from time to time. And for large batteries, we're still at the very beginning of this market, and and so the safety is going to have to be foundational for addressing it.
Okay, thank you. And you already addressed perhaps this question, but are there safety hazards related to battery recycling itself? And if there are, how could the safety be improved?
And I think the safety issues with battery recycling are really the very first and front and center type of thing. And we can kind of look at this in terms of the safety of events that can lead to a fire, and also the safety of particulate matters and physical characteristics that can be that can be detrimental. Also things like PFAS, PFAS materials that can be utilized in these types of batteries, and with large format, all of these things just get to be compounded, and also with having to be able to process things at a high enough scale to be economically useful, then all of these things start to get to be magnified, and one minor problem might be, in a risk assessment, could be very difficult. So our approach has been to address these characteristic hazards, flammability and that type of thing that are inherent in lithium-ion batteries. And so once those are removed, then there's a lot of other pain points that are addressed in terms of having to industrially process materials. So removal of those class 9, and it's a class 9 hazard. It's a UN definition classification of a hazard. But down to the nuts and bolts, why is it a hazard? It's because they can catch fire, and there's some corrosivity issues that can happen and things like that. But it's not a hazard due to being a listed metal back to lead, let's say. You can't change that, right? So we can change these hazards that are in a lithium battery. The flammability can be dealt with, and such. And so it's for lithium batteries, it's one of the miracles that they're able to work is that in the battery itself, there's these passive layers that build up on materials that are otherwise very reactive, and it's called the solid electrolyte interface, the SEI. And it's kind of an amazing thing that there's so many devices out there that would otherwise catch fire if it weren't for this thing. And so what we've done is to address that in a scientific manner, to be able to utilize that or address that SEI, let's say, and accelerate the passivation, and to yield a material that's inert. We can change battery into essentially a brick. And once that happens, there's a lot of cost that's relieved from distribution and storage, and a lot of safety that's improved. Battery then won't catch on fire unknowingly, things like this. And so there's a cost differential in terms of being able to ship something with a class 9 hazard as opposed to, say, an article. And those are 10 times type cost difference. So by removing that hazard for catching fire, the battery becomes a lot less expensive to handle. It actually becomes a little bit more valuable because you can take measurements on it, you can sort things, you can do some things maybe you wouldn't have done otherwise. Harvesting material, the so-called black mass, the harvested electrode materials, and concentrating value in that so that it can be useful for direct recycling.
Okay, thank you. Lithium-ion batteries are constantly evolving and new materials are being developed. And moreover, there's the next battery technologies beyond lithium-ion batteries, such as solid-state batteries under development. So what kind of challenges does this bring to battery recyclers?
When I was first working on battery materials, it included solid-state, lithium metal batteries. And one of the challenges in that is that lithium metal powders itself. It turns into a powder when you cycle it. So 1,000 cycles, 500 cycles into a lithium solid state battery, and you've got powdered lithium and dendrites and things like this in your battery. It all of a sudden becomes very dangerous. So when I was first thinking about direct recycling and that, these solid state batteries were front of mind. And so the deactivation technologies were developed while we were extracting electrolyte and things like that in the early days. The deactivation of lithium is one of the issues too. And so I think that the technologies that we're developing here are flexible then towards these different batteries that are coming out in the future. And I think that the recyclability and safety aspects really will help to accelerate the commercialization of these new chemistries. You put more lightning in a bottle and in a smaller bottle, even more lightning, they have to have a way to be able to diffuse that, put the brakes on the reactivity at end of life or whenever we need to. Could be an accident, could be, it's time for that battery to be decommissioned. Let's go put it through a process without having to break the bank to get it from point A to point B to do it. So these, the direct recycling technologies, I think, are well suited for next generation of batteries. Cobalt dilute, low metallic value batteries. Direct recycling inherently recovers those materials. And the materials have a value in and of themselves for manufacturing. So bridging those from one material at an end of life to a new material at a new manufacturing without having to do a lot of energy inputs, then still the direct recycling approach is going to be even more appropriate for these next generation systems than, say, the prototypical lithium-ion battery.
Thank you. Before we go, I would like to talk a little bit about the future and ask if you can share with us what is the next challenge in the area of recycling that you plan to work on?
Yes, challenges for the next generation or for the next step include really three things. We're going to put them into three. There's many more than that, but scaling up direct recycling, addressing the early stage manufacturing scrap, decreasing costs for manufacturing lithium-ion batteries as we make this huge leap from internal combustion engines to electric vehicles. So making the cost more sustainable. And right now we are scaling up with manufacturers in the UK to do that very thing, to demonstrate the direct recycling at early stage manufacturing. And that's a very important and critical step to improve the razor thin profitability of lithium-ion battery manufacturing. So that is one of the things. Developing safety and deactivation of batteries so that when deemed at end of life, that there is a service that's available to perform that. And then also just reacting to the new chemistries that are coming out and making sure that the services and products that we're developing are applicable to the next generation. And that also has a two-way street, but it's possible actually to design for multiple generations of manufacturing with lithium-ion battery cathodes on a direct recycling basis. Some people might say, well, the demand for a cathode is going to be different from one generation to another. Well, that might be the case. One of the major issues ends up being the cost of that cathode. So decreasing the cost of the cathode from one generation to another is what people are really going to want in the bottom line. I think you can just look at the lead battery industry to say that, because otherwise we'd be saying, oh, let's use pristine lead every time. We don't. The battery formulation has changed from generation to generation, but the process of a low-cost product, a high-value product, is really the driving force. And so getting that type of a driving force behind a lithium-ion battery is completely possible with direct recycling.
Okay, thank you very much. That brings us to the end of this episode. Thank you, Steve, for joining us for a fascinating discussion about battery recycling. It's been really great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. It's my pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity, Tanya.
Thank you for listening. Let's talk lithium-ion battery recycling. Please stay tuned for the next episode.